everybody. I'm reading from my book, Disinformed. We're reading here chapter 2, The Persuadables. So now shifting the focus more on us, on we who are receiving all of this messaging and information. The first chapter was more about establishing just some of those tricky questions around what is truth and the slippery nature of truth and how the ancient Greeks really viewed that as a central problem. We'll get more into that in this chapter, that what we today call fake news or disinformation or misinformation, even those have technical definitions that we get into, and you can kind of delineate some spaces there. Some people even delineate, some scholars that is, categorize malinformation, and there are other ways of categorizing, of course, that I don't subscribe to all those theories and ideas necessarily, but nonetheless, for Plato especially, and he probably received this from Socrates, likely, as he writes Socrates as a character in his dialogues, this seemed to be a central problem that Plato warns us about, the relationship between truth and language, and how that can go terribly wrong if you don't have some sense of ethics or philosophy united with your usage of language. And we've seen that play out in history so many times, where a really powerful speaker, a really persuasive, talented speaker, is somehow devoid of ethics, somehow devoid of empathy. We don't know exactly what happens there. How do you get the characterization of a Hitler? But nonetheless, that's a very dangerous combination when you have a talented persuader, a very talented speaker and communicator who's missing that sense of ethics and philosophy. Okay, so this is chapter 2, The Persuadables. I begin with an epigraph from every grad student's bane who studies rhetoric, Lloyd Bitzer. I love Bitzer, though, especially that seminal essay, The Rhetorical Situation. I think everybody reads that who studies rhetoric. But the bit I pulled out here, the epigraph, is every audience at any moment is capable of being changed in some way by speech. And Bitzer there is echoing wisdom from thousands of years ago. Gorgias tells us that the effects of speech upon the mind can be like a drug upon the body. And that feels true today, doesn't it? That we can kind of sense something around that. We worry about family members who apparently are brainwashed by propaganda stations and have lost ability to think critically as they partner themselves with some ideological cult or so on. You can really lose someone to speech. You can lose yourself to speech. Okay, for the love of speech. The ancient Greeks loved speeches. Really, it was central to their culture, to their way of life. Telling stories, for example. In the beginning of the dialogue Phaedrus, one of my favorites by Plato, the titular character Phaedrus tells Socrates he has just returned from a morning of making speeches with his friend Lysias. This would seem a rather funny thing in today's world, to meet a friend for lunch, ask them how they spent their morning, only for them to tell you, "Oh, I was just over at Jane's apartment. We were making speeches all morning." It wouldn't be a common occurrence today, but the art of making speeches was very close to the heart of ancient Greek culture, very important to them. This is kind of a lovely idea. It's a funny little joke I'm making there, but maybe worth trying someday. Go make speeches with your friends of an evening. In a world where writing was a relatively new technology, writing tools and materials were expensive, and there was a reliance on an oral tradition. Thus, speech-making was a valued pastime. In many ways, the same desire for communication and storytelling is now fed by our media addictions: television, YouTube, film, podcast, binging on Netflix, and myself included there. We don't want to dismiss the important differences in our cultures, But we also shouldn't forget just how similar humans can be across time and space. But rhetoric wasn't all fun games and entertainment for the ancient Greeks. The renowned classicist and scholar of rhetoric George Kennedy explains in his New History of Classical Rhetoric, it was one of his seminal books, that this fascination with speeches was at least partially due to the vital, life-saving necessity of wielding language persuasively. And Kennedy writes about this elsewhere in his work on comparative rhetoric. He goes so far as to say that all language seems to be related to the desire to preserve energy, or the will to preserve energy. And he's taking kind of like an evolutionary biological position there, where he's saying that, okay, you can imagine animals fighting in the wild, and what they might learn to do so as to not die is to learn how to speak. It's a rough argument, nonetheless. And Kennedy's not an evolutionary biologist, and so you would need to build that line of thinking out a bit more for it to hold up. But it seems a compelling start to a theory that, because we don't know right now, we don't have an established theory for the origin of language. That's just one among many. I mean, there are scholars who think that our language comes from humans imitating birdsong because of the natural musicality of language. I find that convincing too in some ways. When my children learn how to speak, I watch them fairly closely and with interest, even just a personal kind of interest as well as the academic interest. And I noticed that my children seem to develop first the kind of sing-songy rhythm, the cadence, the up and down, the phrasing, almost like a musical syntax of language, before they really learn the semantics, the meaning of what they were saying. That's not strictly true either, because there's so much going on developmentally in the acquisition of language. So that's not perfectly convincing either. They also learn how to ask for things they need. And anyway, the Kennedy idea is something about the conservation of energy is the term that he uses, the self-preservation. And the use of language is something of a survival instinct. And in ancient Greece, this is true, likely where he got the idea and inspiration from. There was no regular system of legal representation in ancient Greece. You couldn't just hire a lawyer very easily. Citizens would often be required to defend themselves in a court of law or to lay out their case against an opponent. So literally, language, speaking well in a court, could be a matter of life and death. In these early days of democratic society, your ability to speak could literally be a matter of life or death. If your neighbor accused you of stealing their goat, or worse, their horse, then you better have been able to make a compelling argument about why it wasn't possible that you stole it, as you proved your innocence. You could make an appeal to ethos, that is your character and credibility. You could say, I am an honest and law-abiding citizen of Athens. How could a person like me commit such a crime? That's an appeal to ethos, my character, my credibility. You dare accuse me, who is an upstanding citizen in all of this? I mean, there's a very... Before the days of photographs and DNA evidence, and I mean, that's all problematic too, right? But in its own way. But before that kind of scientific burden of evidence, what else do you have? You have appeals to character. You could make an appeal to pathos, to your emotions. You could say, I'm a father of 5 children. I must work hard to provide for them. Would you rob these children of their father by imprisoning me based on false claims? You could appeal to logos, the logic. You could say, all day yesterday, I was at the theater of Dionysus, a fact to which many of my fellow citizens can attest. How could I have been in 2 places at once? That's a kind of appeal to logos, to logic. Today, we don't take language seriously enough. The rhetorician Lloyd Bitzer wrote in his essay, The Rhetorical Situation, that rhetoric is a mode of altering reality, not by physically moving material objects around, but by the creation of discourse which changes reality through the mediation of thought and action. This is just an academic way of saying that speech and language can literally change the way we perceive the world, the way we think, and the way we act. You can imagine this in a really distilled way, like you've been targeted by political advertisements of a political party. Maybe you Google a few articles about the candidate, and then you go and you vote for them. And somewhat consciously, but more likely unconsciously, you've been influenced by this ecosystem of advertisements. And it's never just one ad. It's these really complex, your algorithmic echo chamber. It's series of advertisements. It's email automation chains, like fairly sophisticated methods that are used to persuade today. And so then that alters reality. Look at what happened with the Cambridge Analytica. They were using psychographic information to move elections, to alter the outcomes of elections. And it was very effective. It was, the Trump, what do you call it? Campaign, I suppose. The folks working for Trump leading up to the 2016 election hired Cambridge Analytica, and they were using upwards of $1 million a day in advertisements, attack ads against Hillary Clinton. It's interesting for me to reflect back on that period because I'm certain, being a citizen of Michigan at that time, and being in the age group that I am, that I had probably been targeted by these anti-Clinton advertisements. And at that time, I didn't have an incredibly positive perspective. I was really I was feeling the burn. I was interested in what I perceived as the honesty of Sanders as a representative of the working class and middle class. It's interesting to think about whether I could have been unknowingly subsumed into that network of propaganda, lies, disinformation. Anyway, that's just me. We might hear a powerful sermon and be swayed into a life of service to a god. We might see a compelling video advertisement which even imperceptibly or insensibly cements some idea in our mind, which might make a model, or which make and model of an automobile we might want to purchase. Language can have life-altering effects on us. We might be convinced to take a job in a new city or vote for a particular political candidate. Gorgias likened language to a kind of drug, a pharmacon, the term he uses, that we translate to something like a drug. Pharmacon, pharmaceutical. To me, that appears to be a reasonable explanation for the brainwashing and spellbinding experienced by the German population under Hitler in the early to mid-20th century. But it's always easy to see when it's happening in other people, isn't it? How could all those Germans have just fallen right in line with that evil man? They must have been silly, or there must have been something wrong with them. Couldn't they see through his lies? Well, it's difficult, it's challenging. Of course there was resistance to Hitler, but there was also mass adoption of his platform. So maybe no, maybe not. Maybe people couldn't see through the lies. Maybe they bought it. And maybe you would have too if you had been there. Maybe I would have. It's a scary thought, right? It's easy to see when others are being persuaded. It's painful and difficult to see it in ourselves. We like to believe we are immune to persuasion, but we are all persuadable. It's not just language that is persuasive. It's the combined effects of rhetoric that persuade us. Hitler's powers of persuasion included his mannerisms, gesticulations, the timbre and inflection of his voice, his word choice, which we call diction, the way he constructed sentences, his syntax, and his use of rhetorical techniques like allusion or antithesis. These are really powerful rhetorical techniques. You can think of the "we shall fight on the beaches" and "we shall fight on the landing" as a kind of anaphora. So there are techniques within language. Anaphora is the repetition, parallel constructions in subsequent clauses. So we shall do this, we shall do that. We shall do X, we shall do Y, we shall do Z. The repetition of "we shall" is what we would call anaphora. And there are thousands of these little techniques that have been categorized and cataloged. And it's maybe not the most interesting part of the study of rhetoric, is pulling out these rhetorical devices, these literary devices. But it is one way of analyzing the effectiveness of speech. But it's not just that. It's not just those rhetorical techniques. It's the combination of those rhetorical techniques with other things like the bubbling, the kairos of the moment. The conditions have to be there for a Hitler to emerge. It's the mannerisms, it's his appearance, his manner of dress, the people around him, his use of symbolism and architecture, the golden eagle, the standard in the grand Nazi party rallies, and the ubiquitous swastika, the deft wielding of then new technologies like radio, film, and fast travel by airplane. As Quintilian told us, the ancient Roman rhetorician, even the mere look of a man can be persuasive. The mere look of someone can persuade us. That's the kind of Ted Bundy effect I talked about in the first chapter. Contemporary psychology tells us just as much. Tall people make more money over their lifetime, according to findings on a height salary link that was documented in a study by Timothy Judge, Ph.D., and Daniel Cable, Ph.D. In another uncomfortable set of studies, researchers found that attractive women received higher grades in college courses, an effect that diminishes when teaching is conducted remotely and online. We like to think that we're objective, rational, and fair, but there's a broad expanse of research that shows the opposite to be true. We're easily persuaded. We carry many deeply held biases and values within us. And these biases and values affect the way we perceive and interact with others and the world around us. We don't understand fully, comprehensively, scientifically how persuasion works. There's no science of persuasion. It remains an art form. There is at present no satisfactory or complete picture of persuasion in the neurological, psychological, rhetorical, sociological literature, or elsewhere, the medical literature. It's a tricky beast to pin down precisely. Language is complicated. Communication is complicated. Persuasion is complicated. We are practically left with the same conundrum today as our ancestors faced thousands of years ago. In some sense, I'm grateful for this. I have no doubt that if a universal theory of persuasion were discovered, corporations, political parties, and governments would take full advantage of the knowledge, and democracy would be in even further jeopardy. Although this is precisely what is happening already, you best believe that the big tech companies and, say, Russia's disinformation department, they have the best of the best psychologists and social scientists and data analysts, and they have the very bright people working on these campaigns to persuade. Again, the digital marketing spend globally surpassed all other forms of advertisement back in 2017, almost 10 years now from where I'm sitting here. And so follow the money, right? Follow the money. Even without a universal theory of persuasion, this is essentially the place we find ourselves in, using imagery, video, hyper-targeted social media advertisements, psychographic profiling, big data, modern computing power, and complex technological distribution mechanisms. Persuasion and propaganda have become more powerful and more dangerous today than ever before. The UK firm Cambridge Analytica used weaponized social media advertising strategy to influence elections all over the world. While companies at present are spending more money on digital advertising than print, billboards, mailers, leaflets, radio, television, magazines, newspapers, and all other forms of traditional advertising combined. And Cambridge Analytica, what did they call those people they targeted with the bulk of their budget? They called them the persuadables. The persuadables were a demographic of centrists that Cambridge Analytica, that is politically central, not very far to the left, not very far to the right, as most Americans used to be. And, if you took a snapshot of like the mid 20th century, you'd see much less radical political distribution of ideas in the population. The persuadables were a demographic of centrists that Cambridge Analytica profiled as being on the fence and able to be pushed to vote for one candidate over another. Not just in the U.S., but they identified what is the psychographic profile of a persuadable person that can kind of be universally transferred across populations. While we don't know the extent to which, and then drilled down per population, while we don't know the extent to which Cambridge Analytica influenced presidential election results in the U.S., we could never really know for certain. We can rightly assume that companies wouldn't be paying for such services if they didn't yield results. Digital disinformation is a massive global undertaking, and we are the targets. Now, I'm not suggesting we return to the oral culture of the ancient Greeks and we all start making speeches as a form of entertainment. It might be fun, though. We can't force a cultural change like that. We can update our curriculum, though. We can bring rhetoric and philosophy back into the school systems. But what should be most shocking to us is that we have completely abandoned that one field of study that deals directly with these problems: disinformation, propaganda, information literacy. In this time of crisis, when there's more technologically advanced information threatening democracy than ever before in the history of humanity, the field of study that deals with these questions of truth is the study of rhetoric. It can be interesting and fun when done right. And there might not be anything more powerful for a person to learn than how to speak and to write effectively. You can use it everywhere and always. It's something you can carry with you, your voice. Your voice is incredibly powerful. It's how you land good jobs. It's how you carry forward the light and help other people. Write a great resume and a great cover letter, for example. It takes you far in the world to speak and to write well. How can we live in a time like this and not teach our children about rhetoric? The one field of study that could empower them to disarm all of this, advocate for their rights and values in an increasingly polarized realm of political discourse, and to build resilience to the thousands of advertisements and propagandic messages that are launched at them all day long. How else to protect them from the ideologues that fill our schools, companies, and communities? I remember growing up in the UP not that long ago, and I remember, I think every public school teacher that I had was openly religious and infused their teaching with religious ideology and theology. It was inescapable. I mean, I'm not that old. This was not that. I grew up in the 90s. I was born in 1989 and grew up in the 90s and started going to the public schools. And I had great teachers. I had wonderful teachers, and I'm thankful for all the work that they did. But I can't think of a classroom where there wasn't some personal religious theory brought into the classroom. It was very out in the open. I don't know if it's still like that. I can't imagine. My children are in public schools now, and I don't know. That's a separation of church and state problem. It's a problem for free thinking. You want to protect your children to be able to have them think for themselves. Rhetoric is that secret ancient discipline that can help us in our great time of need, because we are all persuadables and we need help. That's the end of the section there. The idea there is we are all persuadable. It's hard to admit that. It's very difficult. When I teach my digital writing class, sometimes I get some pushback from students, which I find really interesting, about the efficacy of advertising and the ethics of advertising. In the past, for example, I've had some students kind of say, like, well, is it really that dangerous? Is it really that effective? Is it really that, what is the, and that's a good question to ask. That's a very good question to ask. What is the evidence of the effectiveness of these massive propaganda, disinformation campaigns? It is very hard to determine that and to track that down in a satisfying way. Again, I think you can follow the money. Companies wouldn't be spending so much of their resources on digital campaigns if they weren't seeing some measurable results. They calculate ROI, or return on investment. I don't know exactly how the ROI equivalent is calculated in political party strategy offices, but I'm sure they have some key performance indicator or metric that they track, a KPI. That's not wild for me to imagine that they're looking at results and thinking about how their digital spend is affecting the outcome of an election. Of course, we know Cambridge Analytica was doing that, so there's an enormous amount of evidence that's all very public about Cambridge Analytica and what they were doing. I encourage you to do a little research on Cambridge Analytica if you're interested in these ideas. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Well, I think we'll wrap that up. My voice is giving out, I guess. But that was just the first section to chapter 2, called The Persuadables. And the main idea being there, you too, my listener, and me too, me the speaker here, we are so very persuadable. And sometimes we're cognizant of it, and sometimes we're not. All the little decisions we make, all the little purchases, how we spend our time. I mean, it's this really messy interface of like human behavior. Addiction perhaps plays a big part into it. Loneliness, we're seeking. I mean, how can you fault someone for finding meaning and purpose in community and not knowing? I mean, I'm thinking about Germans in the 1930s after World War I, and they're destitute and they don't have food for their families. And I mean, they're really struggling and in a lot of pain. And suddenly Adolf Hitler emerges. That must have felt like, it's the return of divine power or something. It must have felt very satisfying and hopeful and interesting. And so I have empathy now for, I can imagine hundreds of millions of people living paycheck to paycheck. That seems to be what the data indicates. We all know it's difficult to make a living right now, and always has been, and probably always will be, and all the horrors involved in making ends meet. And so we must have some empathy for those who are searching for community, searching for purpose, and having the wool pulled over their eyes or something like that. And how do you know you're making the right decision in the end? And what is the right decision? And where's it all headed? And these sorts of things. I can't answer those questions for you, but I can encourage you to ask them. And the tools are already there for you to ask those questions. It's called sitting and thinking and slowing down a little bit and really giving yourself some time to write and reflect and ponder what it is you're doing with your life and what it is that you support and where you might be heading. I'll stop there. That's a nice little thing to chew on, I think, and maybe I'll follow my own advice today and sit and ponder a bit some mystery that's bothering me. Good luck out there. Take care of yourselves.